So last week, I set out on a course to try and talk about the resurrection, but what I did is actually I jumped to the effect, and I leaped immediately to the Apostle Paul, because, as I've told you, the life of Paul really is the greatest example. If one were trying to be a skeptic and approach, is this true? Is all of this true? Is there any fact to any of this? He's the man that's on the far side of the equation, not part of the original group of disciples, not even a part, we're not even told about him on the day of Pentecost. You've got to catch up to the stoning of Stephen to see that he was against the church and against those folks called the Way, the first Christians, making up the first church of Jesus Christ. So, I'm going to jump back to, I don't want to try and talk to you about and try and prove to you whether Christ lived. I think that's a moot point. Muslims fully acknowledge Christ lived. They call him a prophet. There are other systems of beliefs that perhaps recognize minimally that Christ lived. That's not to say that he was who he said he was, but everybody seems to agree that this is not a fictitious person or a made-up or fabricated entity, but a real person that did exist. Whether he was God or not, that's what we're looking at, whether the claims he made about himself are true or not. So I decided to not even try to, am I going to stand here today and explain to you, did Jesus live? No, that can be a message for another day, and we can do that another time. I'm going to jump right to the charges, but initially the charges against Christ. I'm going to start there. That's a very small window when you think about 3+ years of public ministry. Where I'm jumping in the record is essentially the last week of his life. So, as I said, I'm not trying to settle whether he lived or not. We're assuming that for today's discussion. Secondly, involved in the charge and charges brought against Christ, I'm specifically looking at Caiaphas, and you'll have to pardon my spelling and my writing, and Pilate. In the records, you will find that he was also sent supposedly to Herod, and he was also sent to Annas, who happened to be the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. I'm not interested in those. Those are secondary or maybe even tertiary in their value for me today. I'm interested primarily in looking at the way the charges were directed at Christ. And there are three main charges that are from the Jewish tribunal, if you will. Three things that are being said in various places, but specifically now let's write down between Caiaphas and Pilate. There are three main things to consider, and these are the main things. Jesus said he was going to, according to the witnesses, destroy the temple, and that he was the Christ. Definite article is very important. The Christ, the Son of God. And this one is a little bit more complicated. We'll say stirring contention against Rome, i.e. Caesar, the Roman citizens, etc. So, as I began to analyze this, a couple of things were necessary. One, to look at each one of these charges, and then I recognized that charge number one of destroying the temple will not hold any weight. We're going to analyze it, but it will not hold any weight. And the third charge brought against him, basically, which we'll look at, doesn't hold too much weight. So there's only one real charge being brought against Christ that holds any weight. Christ, the Son of God. Now, I know we have attorneys here in the sanctuary, and there are ways to examine something if we were just trying to take our law and make certain applications. The unfortunate thing is most people are not familiar with American courts and American law to begin with, and then they read the Bible and they're not familiar with the Jewish jurisprudence. What technically by law was legal, and what constituted witnesses, who could be a witness. There's several categories here, so I want to go over them with you because when I get to a text, and I don't know how far I'm going to make it in all of my information, so I told you just have to bear with me. There are some staggering, real problematic issues to deal with that if one was merely fabricating this story as dumb fishermen, it'd be hard-pressed to convince me that how could somebody know these things? How could they be aware of this, even though that was their culture? So bear with me for a second as I'm going to read a few things from my notes as well to you. First of all, Jewish law, some have argued with me and some have proposed that Jewish law was subordinate to Roman law because of the Roman territory and the Roman government. But that is not true concerning Jewish religious laws. In other words, everything that was inside the Torah, everything that was concerning the Jewish law, was governed by the Jewish people, was not governed by Rome. And if there was ever a difference between the two, if you comb the legal, you'll find Maimonides is probably the largest propagator of this through the Mishnah, that Jewish law in terms of religious and ceremonial issues always won over Roman law and not the other way around. People are a little bit confused about this. So, for example, if someone was accused of a grave offense, and we'll call it a capital offense. In this case, Jesus is being accused of a capital offense, which we will talk about, worthy of death, the death penalty. The law, the Jewish law, prescribed something specific. Now, there are categories for who would be a person, or what act would be worthy of the death penalty under Jewish law. Sacrificing to other gods other than Yahweh, sacrificing your children to Moloch through the fire, Baal worship, false prophecy, necromancy, blasphemy, Sabbath breaking, adultery, bestiality, murder of another, false witness to a capital offense, and sorcery. Now, those are just to name a few, but those are the major ones. So, how this was dealt with, how capital punishment against Jewish laws was carried out, unilaterally, you'll find if you comb not just the initial Bible records, but elsewhere, you'll find unilaterally was by stoning. And here's what's important. There's one event in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, where somebody was burned. They weren't stoned, they were burned. They were guilty of a capital offense, they were burned with fire. Other than that, the law prescribed certain things that had to happen if somebody was going to be stoned. Now, this is where the Jewish law gets a little freaky, if you ask me. So the Jewish law says that if you're going to stone somebody, you have to push them off of a cliff. That's what the law prescribes. Talk about freak show. You have to push them off a cliff, but the cliff can't be too high so as to basically splatter their body, and it can't be too low as to not cause enough bodily injury or enough leverage to be able to truly stone the person. That's Jewish law. I didn't make that up. That's the law. So why all of this? I'm going to start laying the foundation of the categories, and understanding a little bit of the Jewish law will open up a little vista we tend to take for granted when we read about the trial in front of Caiaphas and we read about the trial in front of Pilate. I want to distinguish that the laws that govern the Jews would not be brought in. They could not bring the charges that they charged him with, that they found him guilty of, before Pilate. So we've got to treat these separately and individually. So we need to understand how the mindset would work, that when we actually look at what happened, it will jar us to a few critical things. There were a lot of illegalities, a lot of things that these are people who are extreme legalists, but they broke the law in trying Jesus. For example, it was illegal to try a capital offense by night, yet we know they did. There's all kinds of stuff that when you start looking, you go, wait a minute, this is a kangaroo court. They just did this, they did that. So, let me get a new page here. We're going to do some writing. All right. Let's talk about first the way a Jewish court would work. In a Jewish court, you need someone to testify or witness. And usually that is someone who has seen with their own eyes or heard with their ears. Now, there's a category, a group of people who would be disqualified from being competent to attest or to testify. And these are listed in the following criteria. If you want to look up the commentary on Maimonides, who is commenting on the Mishnah, and he elaborates on this. I'm only going to write 8 of these. The first one is women. They're not competent to be a witness. Now, if you want to know why, it really is not about gender. We have these limited ideas. It's not about gender in terms of Adam and Eve. It has to do with gender in the Torah. Because nowhere, this is the crazy stuff, nowhere in the Torah, or let's be specific, in the Pentateuch, is the word witness. This is what Maimonides came up with. He said, nowhere in the Pentateuch is the word witness in any other gender but masculine. Therefore, witnesses can only be men. Well, if you're going to use that line of rhetoric with me, then the spirit, ruach, of God is feminine, and that means that a man could never receive the Spirit of God. I am the master at rhetoric. Don't go there. I read that and I kind of went, really? Just rolled my eyes a little bit, like, come on. All right, women. So if women are not competent to testify and to be witnesses, let's just go down a list of a few people that would not be able to attend if they were invited. Elizabeth, the cousin of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary herself. Mary and Martha. These are all people potentially who could be, but disqualified. Mary Magdalene. We've got Salome. We've got Joanna. We've got Peter's mother-in-law. That's not going to look good. All right. You get the point. So we could keep going. We could talk about the woman with the issue of blood who was healed, or the woman taken in adultery, or the woman at the well. There's so many of these that when you begin to really make the application, you realize, wow, that takes out a real good category of people who, if invited, would be disqualified. The next batch of people who would not be competent witnesses would be slaves or servants. Well, in that universe, in that realm, you're talking a huge majority of people who were either slaves or servants. Now, we don't know whether the centurion's son was indeed a son or whether he was simply a servant, but in any case, he may fall into that category. We'll just put him here for fun. Centurion's son. These are all people that could testify that they were either raised from the dead or their eyes were healed or whatever it was. They saw Jesus perform miracles and could have been called as witnesses to anything he said or did because they were there. All right, here comes the next one. Minors. Minors were incompetent or not capable of attesting or testifying until the age of 13, and whatever they said at the age of 13 was still under question, and it was only until they reached the age of 20 years old that their testimony would stand on its own. The next category, you're going to like this one, lunatics, which by Jewish criteria also includes epileptics, people with diverse palsies. There's a whole myriad number of these. So if you count lunatics as people who are possessed by a devil, we've got abundant of these that Jesus had encounters with. So you'd have to put those and say, those cannot be either. And I listed the scriptures on my list here. Then you've got the blind. I mean, they're going to go down this one by one. The blind cannot be a witness based on Leviticus 5:1 that says you must hear or see. It cannot be somebody else's record given to you. Now, that being said, this is quite important. That means that the blind people that Jesus healed, could not testify or be a witness, even though they received their sight. Why? Because they didn't see it when it happened. That's the way the law works. I didn't make this up. You can go check it out. I always invite you to check it out. The wicked could not be competent. Now, we need to make sure we define this category a little bit. So, a person like Zacchaeus, who was wicked? He was skimming money off of people and whatnot. Or maybe we're talking about the woman at the well who had many husbands, and the one she was with wasn't her husband then. Any category of wicked persons could not be a competent witness. Now this one gets even better. Relatives. Okay, so just a slight observation. Did you notice how, just randomly, I'm just saying this, it's a gratuitous thought, but it did make me think a lot of the fact that we see Joseph in the birth narratives, Joseph and Mary, Joseph, and then he just disappears from the pages. Okay, we'll come to that mystery another day because I don't have the answer for that. But relatives could have been, for example, Joseph, could have been James, could have been, and we'll go down the line, which again would include Zacharias and Elizabeth, cousins, could include marriage unions, relatives by marriage, by birth, or by redemption, like one who has redeemed another by virtue of the kinsman-redeemer concept. So that's out. Let's go to a new page. You got to have them all here. There we go. All right, number 8. The category is interested parties, which does not mean they had a good time. Not limited to gain, financial or other, or those who had a stake in the matter, that their testimony could not be used or their witness could not be used because there would be ramifications if, or they would be beneficiaries if. Now, we might say that into that category falls Peter, Bartholomew, Philip, Simon, Thomas, John, James, the 5,000, the 4,000, Joseph of Arimathea, and Nicodemus. Who are we left with? Nobody. So, Jewish law is pretty good. They got everybody pretty much, it's air-clad. We're not going to let you use anybody. Now, I should qualify. There is a qualification on the wicked. And let me just say what that is. That's divided into 5 separate groups in that category, which I didn't put for you. And they are criminals, swindlers, perjurers, illiterate, and informers. And underneath that category of wicked is also anyone who wishes to be a witness or to attest, but has no inkling of the Bible and or the Mishnah or civilized standards code of conduct, and is presumed to be, therefore, incompetent as a witness. Agnostics and heretics would also be under the category of wicked and therefore disqualified. Wow, who's left now? Really? I mean, who's left? So you get the idea of how Jewish law may have come into play with the trial, or the supposed trial, of Jesus. Now, there are several issues that I want us to look at because they are, in my opinion, quite important. To understand the value of a witness and what a witness means, I want you to keep in mind there was also a penalty, which I said, the death penalty also went to false witnesses. If you perjured yourself, knowingly swearing an oath and saying something that is wholly fabricated, if it was found out that you were indeed guilty of this, death penalty. All right? So it seems like if you understood the law, there would be very little persuasion to twist or to kind of pervert it. That is not necessarily the case with what's going on here. So I think what fascinated me the most is that when they bring Jesus in, and we probably have to turn, we'll do it in order, so they're in order, starting with Matthew's gospel. That makes it easier to just go how the books are organized. When Jesus is brought in before Caiaphas, I want you to read carefully. This would be Matthew 26 and I'm starting at verse 57, but I'm going to read down a little bit at verse 59. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death. They wanted to put him to death. All of these things we know. Anyone who studied the Bible say, well, of course, that's a fact. They wanted to put him to death. They searched for false witnesses, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. Now, they went to all this trouble to search out witnesses who would testify falsely against Christ. And then suddenly it says, at the last came 2 false witnesses. Verse 61 says that the false witnesses said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." Kind of interesting. The high priest arose and said unto him, "Answerest thou nothing? What is it which with these witnesses against thee?" Now, Jesus didn't say a word. That's the account in Matthew. If you'll turn to Mark's gospel and read virtually the same thing, same line of questioning before Caiaphas, and that would be in Mark 14. And in Mark 14, at verse 58, the same thing is occurring except we have in Mark 14, we heard him say, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." But neither so did their witnesses agree together. So the first thing I want you to notice is they had to search out false witnesses. And if this was a fabricated story on its face, Mark writing for Peter as Peter's secretary, why would they fabricate the fact that they had to go and search for false witnesses and then their false witnesses fell through? If you're going to come up with false witnesses, you'd think that these people, boy, I almost said the M word, these people, well, that's the Greek word for stupid, so it's okay. The Greek for stupid is moron. That's a true statement. You would think that they would have them collaborate on their story and corroborate, so in testifying they would have one solid thing that they're saying that unilaterally is the same, but it didn't happen that way. Now, what they are responding to, and this is what's so mind-boggling, what these people are saying they heard is what is recorded for us in John's Gospel in the 2nd chapter. Please turn there. These are the small, minuscule investigative ways that we can look at how people understand what they're reading. John chapter 2, and this is right after Jesus goes into the temple and he cleanses the temple by chasing out the money changers and overthrowing the tables, and he says, "You've made my Father's house a house of merchandise." And his disciples remember that it was written, "The zeal of thine own house hath eaten me up." That is verse 17. Then verse 18 says, "Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? What are you going to show us?" Jesus answered and said unto them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. I will raise it up. 3 days I'll raise it up." Now, why is that so important? Because we read, although sometimes I don't think I'm reading English when I talk to you, because my mind is a jar with multiple languages, but when we read this, we can clearly read from the Greek what's going on, which is so radical. This is just one example. I'm not going to do anything else today in terms of translation or grammar, but I want to show you why investigating these particular points, some of these things become really important. So, what we have in Matthew, let's start there first. In Matthew's gospel, we have here, they're saying that Jesus said, "Dunamai, I am able, katalusai, to completely destroy the temple of God, and through or in or by 3 days, trion imeron, 3 days." Here's an important thing. Oikodomesai. That's the word that you would use to build up as we're going to build a building. We're going to make construction. We're going to construct something. So in 3 days, I will build it. We could say that's a pretty much word for word of what's going on. In Mark's gospel, they say, we heard him say the following. From Mark's gospel, we heard him say, "Ego, I will completely destroy ton naon, the temple, tuton ten, this being, I'm going to go to this, made with hands, made with hands, and common denominator, through, by, or in, here it is, trion, 3 days, another, alon, another, not. Remember A at the front puts it in reverse? Not made with hands. And we have that same word, oikodomeso, I will build, as a regular building. But let's take a look at what is said, and what is said in John's Gospel. When you see it, becomes radical, because no one, including myself until I looked at the grammar, and then I stayed kind of stupefied because of the following. In John 2:19, he's speaking to who? To the Jews. He's speaking to the Jews in John 2. He's responding to them. They're asking him for a sign. He says here, lusate. So I have to do this. All of this, these two verses, Matthew 26 and Mark 14, are self-explanatory. This one needs a little explanation in grammar. This is a verb like these other ones, dunamai, but this is a special situation here. This is a verb in the imperative. Now, come on, even my Hebrew students know, what does the imperative mean? Second person, right? You do this. Am I right? Yes. Good. That's about 50% of you. I told you, you all took a Hebrew vacation, but that's going to be over soon. All right, verb, imperative, and let's just put down here active. So basically he's saying, when he's speaking to the Jews, he says, you, the word lusate, you destroy. You destroy. He's talking to them. He doesn't say, I'm going to destroy. He says, you destroy this temple, all right? And in 3 days, and here's a very different word, very different from the oikodomesai, very different from the oikodomeso, but here we have igero, that is to raise up with the concept attached of resurrect, to raise up it. I will raise it up. I will raise up it. I will raise up it. Referring to his body, as they said. Now, what's radical about this is in Matthew and Mark's accusations in the trial of Caiaphas, these false witnesses that are brought forward, it's painted as though Jesus is saying, I will do such a thing in my own strength, in my own ability, or perhaps let's reach a little bit in our minds, because the capital offense would also be sorcery. So if he was going to destroy Herod's temple and then build it again, it would have to be in a magical, supernatural way, and then they could get him on sorcery. But all of this falls apart. Remember, we read as English readers. We're not reading like Greeks reading our natural native language. So when you look at this, you go, wow, what Jesus was saying to those Jews is, you will destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. Now, come back into the trial now. Let's go back inside the trial room, and you realize that there's something radical going on here. So let me go back to first Matthew. Let's go back to that passage we were looking at in Matthew 26. The fellow said that Jesus said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said, you're not going to answer anything about these witnesses? Now, Jesus held his peace, and there's something really missing in Matthew's writing, which you have to kind of go and read elsewhere. This is another one of those internal proofs that no one could fabricate this, because you need John, by the way. You need the Gospel of John to know what he said. You will not find this utterance in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. You need John. That's why I said sometimes when you begin these analyses, you kind of stand back and you say, wait a minute. This is all God-breathed. But don't just, well, okay, that's easy for you, Pastor Scott, because you believe all this stuff, but I don't. Well, let's see what happens here. So we're still looking at the trial, and we're still looking at this capital offense charge. But I want you to see something very subtle. Under Jewish law, technically, they called these false witnesses. And don't think that these are two contradicting Matthew and Mark, because several came forward. If you read the accounts, several came forward, and all of their accounts fell through. So I believe both of these were uttered, both Matthew and Mark. But what's so radical is that if we wanted to take Jesus into the courtroom and really give him a fair trial, Effectively, he would be the witness. He wouldn't be on trial. He would be the witness, making the allegation that someone was going to harm him. When you understand the law, do I have enough lawyers in here to understand, is that a radical thing? That's pretty crazy to realize that basically just from the grammar, you realize what Jesus is saying is, you're going to destroy me, which if we brought him into a real Jewish courtroom, he would be the one as witness saying, they're going to destroy me. Because he hasn't done anything thus far. He hasn't done anything to the temple. All they could say is, it's speculation, speculation. All right, I get a little, I get caught up in the courtroom moment, but then I realize it's not a courtroom. All right, sorry. But, you got to get a little excited here. Now, that's Matthew. Let's go back to Mark again. And I don't think I'm going to get through all of my information, but I don't care. You'll just have to come back. That's what I got to say about it. You just have to come back. All right. Now, we're back in Mark's gospel. And it says, for many bear false witness, verse 56, 1456, for many bear false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bear false witness against him, saying. So that's why I said Matthew and Mark, they should both be considered because there were multiple people that stepped forward. Now, listen to what happens here. They say, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. What does that mean? It fell apart. Nothing can be done with this. And in a Jewish court of law, under traditional Jewish law, there would be no ability to cross-examine after that point was made. They didn't say, these are the multiple charges. They came at him with this one charge. There would be no ability to cross-examine. Sorry, some of you lawyers sitting here going, wow, I don't want to be in a Jewish courtroom then. But what I'm trying to tell you is this is quite radical. The other thing is the fact that these witnesses in Matthew and Mark perjured themselves. Now, we don't have any mention of the fact that these people were punished by death, because that's what it required when you bore false witness. That's what you can read in Deuteronomy, you can read it in Numbers, and you can read it in Leviticus. Bearing false witness, worthy of the death penalty. But that didn't happen. Or at least we have no record of it. Now, it seems like all of this work, and then it seems that's abandoned. And immediately we come to this, Caiaphas is now going to abandon the charge against destroying the temple, and then does something quite radical. In Mark's gospel, the high priest said to him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? You will read in Matthew, I'm not going to have you turn there because back and forth, but you'll read there that an oath is undertaken. So what Mark does not include, Matthew does, and he says, I adjure you by the living God. And that type of an oath required, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Now, what's so mind-boggling about this is we've already abandoned the first one. I told you in the charges brought against Christ, you've got to abandon number one. It can't hold any weight because false witnesses, and they're making accusations against him, which in fact he didn't even say what they alleged that he said, and what he said would have put him in the position to press charges against them because they were about to do something against him. So Caiaphas puts him under this oath and says to him, I adjure thee under this oath, which, by the way, you'll find in the book of Leviticus. If you're looking for what happens for swearing an oath, when you swear that oath, you are bound to answer. One thing you cannot do in Jewish law is be silent. And we know from the record that Jesus did a lot of that in some of these. You cannot be silent. Now, in all of the records lined up where Caiaphas is asking, you'll find 3 different answers to the question, art thou the Christ, the Son of God? Mark reads Jesus saying, I am. In Matthew, thou sayest. And in Luke, you say that I am. And there are several dynamics here to this. Again, if we were trying to understand what this means, they're charging him with blasphemy. But even our understanding of blasphemy is flawed under Jewish law. So let me take you on this ride before we understand he's going to be condemned. And he's going to be condemned, which effectively, by their own law, they could have taken him and stoned him. They didn't need permission. Some people have argued, well, it was under the governing body of Roman rule, not under religious pretense. They governed themselves under the religious conditions and laws. They could not bring their Jewish laws to a Roman court unless it affected Roman life, Roman rule, and spilled into the civil affairs. So, before I go any further, I love the fact that in this context, when you line them up, I am, thou sayest that I am, we have something staggering being said. Our understanding of blasphemy perhaps is taking the Lord's name in vain, but when you find the definition between the Mishnah, between Maimonides' interpretation, and between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, specifically, I will read you one passage that will give you an idea of why sometimes we may say we understand what the consequences of blasphemy are. But essentially, and I'll read it to you. If you want to turn there, you can. But in Deuteronomy 13, it talks about if there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams that giveth thee a sign or a wonder. I think that could perhaps fit the category of Christ. The sign or wonder come to pass, whereof he spake unto thee, saying, let us go after gods or other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God proveth you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and cleave unto him. Now, if you keep reading in Deuteronomy 13, you come to the passage where it says specifically, if thy brother, the son of thy mother, thy son, thy daughter, thy wife of thy bosom, thy friend, which is thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, let us go serve other gods. So you have to understand that blasphemy would not only mean in the law, as in the law, the Ten Commandments, cursing the name of God, but also luring people away from serving the God they claimed was the only God. Now, what would happen if somebody stood in front of this religious council saying, to the charge, are you the Son of God? Essentially saying the very thing that is not just blasphemy. The way we would interpret blasphemy is cursing the name of God, but professing to be of God. And there's something that's even more crystal clear in all of these allegations, which is not just randomly a son of God, because every priest and every Jew in Israel and under that Roman rule called themselves a son, not the son, a son of God. You say, well, I doubt that very much. Well, just read Deuteronomy 14 where it says, ye are the children of the Lord your God. Every person had the right to claim that. The difference is in an indefinite versus a definite article. The Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, let's just entertain me for a minute. What would be the ramifications if this was indeed true? What if? Entertain the thought for just a minute before I go down another pathway. Entertain the thought for just a minute. What if for the Jews it was true and this man indeed was the Son of God, which to them it would be impossible? But what would it mean? Well, first of all, it would mean that the scriptures would have to have been fulfilled in their eyes. And there were many scriptures. We're only talking about the Old Testament. There was no New Testament. Psalm 2:7 tells us about the only begotten Son. Remember, we translated that from the Hebrew, and it's kind of radical. You step back and you say, wow, there's Christ right there. And many of these messianic psalms, Psalm 89 speaks of the messianic kingdom. Well, Son of God would have been the institution, essentially, of a new age, ushering in a completely new realm of rule and dominion, and essentially pressing out what had been long established, the priesthood. Now, let me ask you something. This is not just a question of profit, money. We think in our time, people get into ministry and they want to be in ministry for money. But there's a whole myriad number of things at stake here. It's not just money. It's not just finances. Prestige, power. Now, why I'm highlighting these is because there's no way, if you follow the trial of Caiaphas and all of the allegations that are made regarding Christ and the ones that fall through and the ones that stand, Caiaphas magically gets Jesus ushered in Pilate's presence that quickly, which means he had to not only be high priest, but he was a man of power and prestige, because you don't just randomly show up at this Pilate's door and say, hey, we got a guy here that claims to be God, and we'd like to know what you think. It doesn't work like that. So it's not just a monetary thing. And the ramifications for this would be incredible, but the most important thing is that the priesthood, they knew their own scriptures. The priesthood would be changed forever. Everybody understood, if you were reading in an expectancy of the Messianic kingdom, what it meant for you as a Jew and as a priest and as a servant meant a radical change. So, this is what's interesting. That's on the Jewish side, if it's true, Son of God, if it's true. If we're looking at Son of God status from Christ's perspective, it becomes easy, because you can go down all of the different places that we know. These are like climbing a rock wall. In Christ as the Son of God, we have the source of eternal life. We have the foundation of faith. We have got Christ revealing to us the Father, which we could never see. But Christ revealed him. John says Christ is the exegesis of God. The price of reconciliation, both in him and redemption of the lost, affirmation of the deity, victory over destruction of death and Satan. There's all of these dynamics that if you begin to catalog them, why wouldn't these people be saying, what if? But I'll tell you what, as I began to read this, it really dawned on me that underneath all of this, if you read the Chronicles very careful, you're going to find that there had to be something underneath Caiaphas and all of the, not just what if we lose our position and what if we lose our power, but there was a fear. Well, let me put it to you this way. If Jesus was in town a few days before he gets arrested, and everybody's following Jesus around, Jesus is in town, we're going to go see Jesus, and everybody's following after Jesus, and throngs of people are following Jesus, do you really think that they needed to hire Judas to find Jesus? We're not talking about we're not talking about like the state of California. We're talking about an area probably smaller than Manhattan and definitely less populated, if that. I mean, really small. So do you really think they would have trouble finding him? The question is, why did they have to use Judas? And why did Judas, there's all these different questions. I know, I'm doing it to you again, because then you're going to go, yeah, why did that happen? And I'm so good at that, because that makes me know that you're going to be thinking and pondering these things, not just hearing me and going, yeah. All right, so here is the key issue. If you take what I'm saying, it becomes really evident that when they come to arrest him, they come and arrest him with swords and staves, and they come in mass droves, and they come with torches by night. Now, it was said Judas would, the one that he kisses, this is him, and then they arrest him. But I want you to think about this. Jewish leaders, prominent people, and here's this lunatic making claims about himself and doing these miracles and everything else. Why come and arrest him with swords and staves? If he's just a nutbag, then you go get him wherever you get him and you take him away. Isn't that logical? Why do you need swords and staves? What are you afraid of? By the way, why do you need this entourage? I mean, if you think about it, Jesus goes into the garden, takes his disciples to pray, and he's with those few praying. And it's the one time where I had to stop reading and say, there is something not cohesive in the whole flow of things. Why did they have to wait in the garden? Now, they're all tired. They've had the Last Supper, probably have full bellies. They've had their whole day's worth. Now they can barely stay awake. Jesus says, watch and pray. They can barely stay awake, and he says, comes back, couldn't you watch and pray with me? Couldn't you watch and pray with me? Wake up. Okay, now the hour's at hand. Let's go. The one who betrays me is right here. It's almost as though when I read that, I get the impression that Jesus is in control of time. Jesus is in control of all the players. That's not to say manipulation by sorcery but he's in control of all of this. And the reason, coming back to the trial now, that this is so radical, I believe that they had some underlying fear, and it wasn't necessarily because they would lose their position, their power, and their money. What if this was true? Now, this is kind of a today's application, because you really find out what Christians believe, what they really believe, when you're faced with terrible news of your health or your finances and something dire has happened. You really find out if what you believe has just been church going, sitting there, and hey, amen, hallelujah, or whether it's really real to you. This is where you find out what you really believe, and if it really is real to you versus just some mind, whatever you want to call it, that just, okay, I believe that, but nothing more. So I believe these people had a certain fear. There was something about this man calling himself, as he did, the Christ, or better yet, not really responding to the charge. Now, I would like to go back to Christ's answer for a minute, because some people don't necessarily study the nuances of this, and I would just like to say the manner in which he responded to Caiaphas when he says to him, "Thou hast said," or "Thou sayest." I don't want anybody to think that Christ is avoiding answering, because logic would say, just say yes or no, right? If he'd have just said yes or no, wouldn't that be much more simple than "Thou sayest"? Like, you ever had an argument with somebody? Okay, that's what you say. Like, okay. You ever do that? Okay, no, that's what you believe. Okay, fine. That's what you believe. But that's not what Jesus was saying. It was not customary to answer in front of the high priest, believe it or not, with a definite yes or a definite no. It would be disrespectful. These are all these little things that when you begin reading law, you go, wow, okay. But you should also not give silence, which I said Jesus did engage in. But when the high priest hears what Jesus says, "Thou hast said," I'm reading from Matthew, "Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy." Here's the killer right here. "What further need have we of witnesses?" Well, they didn't have any. All their witnesses fell apart. Hey, think about this. Here we are, we have this trial going on. Caiaphas and his kangaroo court says he's guilty of blasphemy. Now, I wish we could call the devil as a witness. That'd be the best. Because the devil and the demons in the record of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they recognized Jesus. He didn't need to be introduced like, "Hey, would you like to meet Jesus, my friend?" No, he came on the scene and they were scared of him. And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, God, the Son of God." They knew who he was. This is the crazy stuff. Who could make something like that up? Fantasy brains on steroids. Now, what about this Son of God status? Because I'm still not done with this. So the only thing I'd say to you is, what could this possibly mean? And why would they not just, okay, he says he's Son of God, let's just go stone him now. But instead, in the record, the most bizarre thing, and I think it's the most bizarre thing, if you're going to write an account, make up something much better than this, because this just, to me, is kooky. They could have communicated his sentence of death, and it would have been a done deal. Now, instead, they bring him, chapter 27 of Matthew. "When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor." Okay, here comes the problem. They didn't just bind him and say, "Okay, now we're all going to Pontius Pilate's house because try and think of this like, try showing up at the White House and saying, "Hey, Obama, I'm here for coffee." Well, a couple of people have tried that by jumping the fence. It didn't work out too good. But I want you to put flesh and blood on this, because we have these, I think, cartoon ideas. You don't just walk in to Pilate's hall or his house or his place and say, "Okay, now we have this prisoner here." So what I looked at was now lining up Matthew and Mark and the delivery of Christ. And if you only had this, you'd be missing information. If you're only looking at Matthew and Mark, you would have a strange situation go on here. Jesus, in verse 11 of Matthew 27, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Art thou king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him and said, "Thou sayest." Now, Do you really believe that that is the way an inquiry, a trial would start? How did Pilate know that this, if they just randomly delivered him to Pilate, how would he know that this is the charge? And by the way, isn't this a little bit different than what he was convicted of with Caiaphas? Of course it is. So, here's the question. Art thou king of the Jews? Matthew and Mark have this where we just walk in the middle of something. You have to read Luke and John for the details. So, if you're tired of turning pages, I'll read it to you. Otherwise, turn there with me. We'll first look at Luke, and then we'll look at John. So the details, we'll first look, we'll look at Luke, and then we'll look at John. So the first area we're going to see in Luke's gospel will be in chapter 23. And you'll find the charge right there. That's why I said you need all the records. And people say, well, are these documents reliable? Well, if we were making up a story, we'd all stick to the same thing. But here's pieces of information in Luke that Matthew and Mark do not have. And if your bladder is raging right now, hold your peace. It's just a way of checking to see if you're still... There's nothing worse than talking to people and you have this look, it's pained look. I'm not sure if you're tired or if your bladder's about to burst. So just 5 more minutes, we'll bring this somewhat to a close. And they began to accuse him. This is Luke 23 and verse 2. We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, this is what is so staggering. They could not bring their charges as they defined them into Pilate's court. What would Pilate care if he said he was Son of God? There were, for the Romans, there were many gods. There were gods. Caesar was a god, so who cares? But now you're starting to push on the nubbin of things. They didn't have enough weight, and I also think they wanted Pilate to do it in the what if. We always talk about Pilate washing his hands, but the Jews did a better one by basically saying, we want him put to death, but you do it. And Pilate turns around in one of these accounts and says, wait a minute, it's your problem, you crucify him. That's in John's gospel, but it's First Book of Scott interpretation. What I'm saying is, who could fabricate the switch? If you're going to be consistent in making an allegation, you're going to see it all the way through. Who could fabricate such a thing? So now Pilate 3 times, before sending Jesus to Herod and then back to Pilate, 3 times says, I find no fault in this man touching these things wherever you accuse him of. I don't find anything. So it almost didn't happen. Now remember, I started off by saying 3 charges being held against Christ. Destroying the temple, which fell apart, and the last one, the stirring up contention against Rome and Caesar, and the expression of the Jews saying, hey, if you don't carry out this execution, you are no friend of Caesar's. Huh? And then the ultimate hypocrisy of the Jews of saying, we have no king but Caesar. I mean, when you really begin to look at this, no mortal could fabricate such a fabulous tale and make it all come together, needing each of these writers, needing each other to shore up and verify, and in the nuances of their discrepancies shows the honesty of the writers. So now, what I want to point out to you is this. If we have the charges, which we've just looked at, the trial before Caiaphas, and we've just, in a snapshot, looked at the one before Pilate, where they accuse him of being a malefactor, they call him in John, perverting the nation, forbidding them to give tribute to Caesar, and ultimately the charge of Christ as King of the Jews. Probably a thing they loathe the most, the Jews, to hear that or to see that. But what is the ultimate slap in the face is that an innocent man is being declared guilty for stating a truth. And it really fundamentally comes down to whether a person will accept the truth. Even Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? He asked the truth to define what truth is, but for a man like Pilate, he could not receive that truth. So I know I'm not going to get to where I need to go, so I'm just going to tell you that on the other side of this, what needs to be addressed, not just the charges, not just the trial, but the communication, the actual committing of, where every single record seems to be in agreement of the hour of his crucifixion, that darkness came upon the land at noon, and by 3 o'clock he was dead, and that every account seems to come to a strict conclusion about a tomb which he was placed in. I'll give you some danglers, and you can figure out if you want to come back and hear the rest of my conclusion next week. These are the things I propose to address and put out there to bring something to a summary. I don't want to have to review, so I really urge you to come next week so I don't have to go through a review because it'll be painful for me and for you. But what things we have never considered? Why is this mystery man, Joseph of Arimathea, suddenly a secret follower showing up to beg the body of Christ? And we always have these beautiful images in art of Jesus being taken down by the cross, and La Pieta, Mother Mary, is holding her dead body's son. But in fact, by Jewish custom, it would take an 8-foot linen sheet to get that body down off the cross, wind it and wrap it down. There's a technique that they use to take the malefactors or the victims off of the cross. And Joseph of Arimathea couldn't have done it himself. Can you imagine one man winding a body that perhaps weighed somewhere between 170 and maybe 200 pounds, depending on how much or how less, by himself, and going from Golgotha to the grave? He must have had some help. If you want to hear about that, you'll have to come back next week. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.